Hey guys, it's Filmington. In this video, we're going to be talking about two of the independent card grading companies, those being BCCG, which is a Beckett service, as well as GMA. And we're going to be assessing all aspects of these services, whether it's a good value, whether it makes sense to store cards in those holders for investment, speculative purchases of those items, and ultimately whether or not there's a distinct probability of those card grading services to at some point maybe supplant one or all of the major third-party graders in the future. So that would be PSA, Beckett's BGS service, as well as SGC. So if you're watching this video, you're probably not foreign to the fact that there's been a lot of scandalous-like activities and events surrounding these large third-party grading companies. With PSA, there's a great video that summarizes all of this. There's actually many videos that have been done by this individual, Keith, Vintage Card Curator. I'll include a link to his video in the description below. He talks about whether PSA was incompetent or whether they were willingly accepting and grading and authenticating cards that had been blatantly trimmed and altered. So not a whole lot PSA is giving us there. People have asked again and again for more transparency, for more advanced processes and technology, for better training of graders, and they have not come back with anything of the such. Instead, former CEO of PSA, now CEO of CLCT, the parent company, Joe Orlando, kind of came back with a pompous remark saying that, it's our responsibility to not get cheated. So, kind of nullifying the fact that we're relying on them for their third-party expertise. But then you also have Beckett BGS. Earlier this year, it was discovered from a few vigilantes at Blowout that there was a string of consecutive BGS 10 black label grades that came from the result of a submission or multiple submissions of a former grader and employee of Beckett that is still connected with a lot of those graders and the company as a whole. If you've submitted on your own, or if you've just seen the availability on eBay of BGS 10 black label listings, you know that getting 5 or 6 in a row, never mind more than that, 10 or 11 in a row black label tags, even if we're talking modern cards, is very, very highly unlikely. SGC has also been caught up in this, but to a much lesser extent. And today, again, we're going to be evaluating GMA and BCCG. Those are two of the more prevalent independent card grading services. There are a number of other ones, many of which do not exist for reasons including and beyond just being suspect or being known to have captured cards that have been either altered, trimmed, or fake. Some of these include, and I'm not sure if they all exist today, but Gem, so Gem Elite and also Pro. All right, guys, so first we are going to look into GMA. Let's take a look at their website for a little bit. As you can see, here's the landing page. It's mobile optimized. The interface is fairly intuitive on the surface. We scroll down here, we see that there's a guaranteed 7-day turnaround, which with PSA and Beckett, you're usually not getting a guarantee at all. And those days don't factor in weekends and holidays on top of that. And also the 7 or 5 day service with either of those services is not very affordable at all. And as you can see here, slabs can cost as little as $3. If you don't go bulk, it's $3.50. They also do autograph authentication, which we're not going to talk about much in this video. Again, looking at their website, you can see that they have some testimonials. So let's click on those. And these seem to be real testimonials. They can be linked to the source, which is Facebook. So I'm going to just open up Facebook. I'm going to look at some more of these testimonials. The overall score, high 4s here, seems to be pretty solid. So we're just going to dig into some of the specific feedback and do our own little accelerated investigation to see if these have any merit or not. So this first one has to do with them being fairly conservative in the way that they grade their cards. So overall, just being strict from a grading standpoint, which, as I know and as others know as PSA or Beckett or SGC collectors and investors, we know that part of the reason why we like those companies is they are fairly stringent. So that relative difference in demand and value that you get with the higher grades is certainly warranted. So let's take a look at GMA's grading scale and how that compares with one of the more reputable players in PSA. This should be, for the most part, a apples to apples comparison because the grading scales are represented very similarly. At least for the more prevalent top grades, they are defined in the same way. They're both calling a 10 a gem mint card. They're both calling 9s a mint card. 8.5 would be near mint to mint plus. So all of this information can be extracted very easily from the websites, and I've just laid out some of the high notes here. For a Gem Mint 10, and this is starting with PSA, you would need a card with at least 60-40 front centering, 75-25 centering on the reverse. They're calling out 4 perfectly sharp corners, sharp focus, original gloss, and they also say that a slight printing imperfection may be allowed. If it doesn't affect the overall aesthetics of the card, they're calling it out as a virtually perfect card. Now, when comparing that to a GMA Gem Mint 10, you would need 60-40 front and back centering, which is actually more strict than PSA's 75-25 on the reverse. They're also calling out sharp focus. They call out sharp corners. They say that slight printing imperfection or surface scratch may be allowable as long as it doesn't affect the overall look and aesthetics of the card. So very similar across the two. The main two things that stand out for me: PSA, much more lenient on centering when it comes to the reverse, and GMA is seemingly maybe not as stringent on the corners. PSA calls out 4 perfectly sharp corners. GMA just says sharp corners, doesn't have that explicit perfectly language in there. Now, when we look at the definitions for a 9 mint card, PSA says 65-35 front centering or better, 90-10 back centering, very lenient there. They are also allowing 1 imperfection, so either a wax stain on the reverse, a minor printing imperfection, or slightly off-white borders. When we look at GMA's definition for Mint 9, they're still wanting 60-40 front and back centering, so that discrepancy gets even wider here. GMA much more strict on the centering, front and reverse with a 9. They call out sharp focus, sharp corners, and they say that imperfections, that's plural, could be allowed. They called out a few examples. It could be other stuff too, slight nick to one corner, small print dot, a minor print or refractor line. So looking at the different descriptions or definitions of 9s, you see that, again, GMA is much more strict on centering. PSA seems to be more strict on surface imperfections, calling out that only 1 is allowed, or GMA says multiple might be allowed. But I guess the point is after looking at 10s and 9s, 2 of the more prevalent grades that these companies assign, you can't really deduce which company is more strict just from this language alone. So this is why we're going to look at something else. We want to see the distribution of grades assigned across GMA and PSA. But how can we do that? Because GMA doesn't have a database that keeps track of all the grades that were assigned and all the cards that were authenticated, unlike PSA, BGS, and SGC. So instead, we are going to take a look at eBay listings, just all the items that are available for sale across different grades across the 2 companies, starting with GMA. If we type in GMA 10, there are just about 20,000 cards that show up. Now, if we type in GMA 9, there are less than 3,000 cards that show up. And if we type in GMA 8, there are about 1,170 cards that show up. So comparing the number of 8s with 10s that are out there for sale on eBay, you're looking at less than 10%, actually close to 5%, as many GMA 8s as GMA 10s that are available. Now let's look at PSA. PSA 10, you see about 185,000 listings of those gem mint grades. With PSA 9, you see a very small drop-off from 185,000 to about 169,000. So a much slower and steadier decline across grades for sure versus GMA. With PSA 8, now again, there were roughly 10%, a little less than 10% as many GMA 8s available as there were GMA 10s. PSA 8, you're looking at roughly 63,000. So, about 33% of 8s versus 10s. So we started by looking at the grading scales across GMA and a more reputable player, PSA. We looked at descriptions, definitions, and on the surface, there were no notable significant differences between the two. You can't really tell objectively from those descriptions which grading company is more strict. But then we looked at the eBay data, which showed a far greater proportion of 10 gem mint grades assigned by GMA. So from here, we can drive to the conclusion that PSA is a more strict grading company. A counter argument could be that, well, GMA hasn't been around for as long, so maybe more of the modern, newer cards are being submitted to GMA versus PSA, and a lot of the times cards coming directly from packs that have been opened in the last 10 to 20 years could already be in gem mint condition. But I would argue against that. PSA CLCT, the parent company, has about doubled in stock price over the last year. A large reason for that is the increase in revenues from the influx of submitted cards. A lot of these cards are being pulled out of breaks, group breaks. A lot of these are newer as well. Also, I took a look independently at eBay, and I saw that there are, in fact, a decent amount of vintage cards in GMA slabs. So that is certainly not the case. Now let's look at another testimonial for GMA. This one, again, pulled directly from Facebook. It is all about value. We know as SGC, PSA, or BGS collectors that one of the things we like is the value retention, the long-term value that these slabs might provide us. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. And what we see here is somebody acknowledging that GMA hasn't really been perceived as being the most valuable brand over the last few years, but they think that it could change in the future. So, we can't look at future data. We can't even really look at time series data for the purpose of this analysis, but let's look at eBay to see what really has sold over the last 90 days in a GMA slab, and let's try to compare that with comparable cards from other grading companies. Right now, we are back on eBay, searched GMA 10 previously sold items. eBay keeps track of the last 90 days worth of data, so that's what we're looking at here. Sorted this by price in descending order, so ultimately this is the reflection of the most expensive GMA items that have sold over the last 3 months. First one is a Jordan rookie. Well, that one is a best offer, so we can't really ascertain a whole lot more from that. Underneath that, we have a Tom Brady 1 of 1 that went for $1,800. That is a 1 of 1 though, so we're not going to be able to compare that to a similar card in a PSA or Beckett holder. And then underneath that, we have a 2011 Topps Update Mike Trout Diamond. GMA 10 went for $1,424, which is a lot less than what it would have went for in a PSA 10 holder, much less than even 50% of that. But if we're to compare what that went for versus a comparable 9 in a PSA or Beckett BGS holder, I didn't have any data for PSA, but with the BGS 9, it went for almost the same amount. So that's a trend that we're going to be noticing, is that the The GMA 10 is often comparable to a 9 and a more reputable holder in regards to what it sells for. Sometimes it'll sell for a little bit more. Sometimes it'll sell for a little bit less. Sometimes it'll sell for about the same. Another example would be this 2011 Bowman Chrome Mike Trout Purple Refractor, or the GMA 10 that went for $775. It was actually less than all of the comps I saw from PSA. But then again, this 2011 Topps Update base Mike Trout in a GMA 10 went for more than most of the PSA 9 comps I had seen. So in conclusion, is GMA good for resale value? Is it good for ROI? I don't know. But what I do know is when I bought most of my GMA slabbed items, as well as the BCCG cards, I was just getting back into the hobby, didn't know what I was doing, wasn't well educated, saw that PSA 10s were out of my price range, or what I perceived my price range to be, thought I was getting myself a gem mint grade of something, when in reality, a lot of these cards aren't really gem mint by industry standards or PSA standards. I will say that I am still holding most of these cards. I've been able to turn over and sell the PSA, BGS, and SGC cards a lot easier. So I'm still not sure if it's good for value. I'm leaning towards no. And now we're going to talk about the other independent card grading company that I wanted to cover. This is BCCG, or Beckett's BCCG service, to be more specific. And looking at the Beckett website, we're going to notice a big difference right away. Specifically, looking at the grading scale, BCCG is very different than the top three grading services, being PSA, SGC, and BGS. Also, it's very different from GMA, which was very closely aligned as we went over with PSA. You're going to notice that even though most collectors, investors in baseball cards and other types of cardboard, we're very conditioned, we're very knowledgeable of the typical 1 to 10 grading system. But BCCG is very, very different. And one might assume that they might have been trying to pull one over on somebody, maybe the lazy, the novice collector or investor. And they've just introduced a whole new proprietary grading system, even though they already have the BGS subdivision or service, whatever you want to call it, that's underneath that Beckett umbrella. So I find that to be a little bit sketchy. I've scoured the internets and message boards. A lot of people have called it a money grab, poor execution, just a terrible, flawed business model. And I would probably have to agree with that for the most part. So looking at their grading standards, their scale here, available on the website, you are looking at something that is entirely different. A 10 is mint or better. So that would kind of be close to a BGS 9 or a PSA 9, one would think. Then if you start going down in grades, you notice a very, very big difference. A BCCG 9 is defined on the label as near mint or better. Compare that with Beckett with PSA, you're looking at least a 7. With BCCG, that means a 9. With a BCCG 8, you're dropping down even further. Excellent or better, that's how BCCG defines it. And looking at BGS and PSA, that means at least a 5. So it's not even close to a 1-for-1. You would almost need a calculator or some sort of Excel spreadsheet to tell you what the equivalency would be across the two. So it can get very confusing for collectors. And again, I personally, the only time when I bought a BCCG slab was when I just didn't know better. So it's almost like now when I'm selling them, I have to bank on somebody being as inexperienced as I am, like I was back in 2014 when I originally purchased these things. So, do or should, I guess, investors and collectors trust these companies? PSA, for all of the scandalous activity and the lack of transparency and their unwillingness to budge on improving just the level of standards and automation and training that goes into the grading process. They do have a guaranteed refund process. It's called the financial guarantee of grade and authenticity. Now, we could debate all day whether they actually implement that or not, and the fine written language around what constitutes something that's warranting a full refund. But at least they have something. You look at some of the other grading companies, will take apart GMA again for this example. You'll see that their website is littered with typos in many cases, really exuding a lack of professionalism. You'll see that their company address is actually tied to a home address. Again, questioning the legitimacy of their operations. Just a couple months ago, my friend stopped by with a card and a GMA holder. The intention was for me to crack it out of the slab and submit it with a few other cards for an upcoming PSA submission. And that is not what happened, because I took the card out of the slab, 93 Topps Jeter GMA 9, as you can see it. And upon cracking it out, I realized, wait a second, the name, Derek Jeter, looks a little blurry, a little out of focus. Seems a little fishy. And then after I cracked it out, I noticed 1992 draft pick. Why is there like a white shadow underneath that? Is that normal? Like a little white underline? I compared it to some other cards on eBay and realized that it was a fake. So not a card that you see a whole lot of fakes out there in circulation, but Derek Jeter is definitely on the rise, and I would have expected an expert, so-called expert company, GMA, to have caught that. Again, there's no such cards in PSA and Beckett holders with those nuances. And if you're to look on blog forums or testimonials from GMA's Facebook page, you'll see other people complaining about authenticated cards from GMA that are fake. So we've talked about a lot of things here. GMA, you have a disproportionate number of 10s. With BCCG, you have a disproportionate grading scale. There's just overall a lack of penetration and popularity across these slabs, especially from a high value card standpoint. Expert investors and collectors, more experienced folks, tend to go in the direction of one of the other three grading card companies. If you want to go a little bit deeper, we can talk about the quality and aesthetics of the slabs. With PSA and BGS, you're getting a fairly rigid holder, one where it tends not to shake around a lot when you do this. PSA has made many advancements in their latest iterations of their slabs that make them more tamper-proof, which was one of the knocks on them in the past. BGS, Beckett, has always been known to be just a very, very rigid holder. It's got the plastic sleeve, of course, inside, which prevents this from happening. Same things happening with GMA. With these slabs, you're just really getting a lightweight, cheap feeling slab. And we can talk about uniformity too. So a lot of people that collect just PSA, there's some, for instance, newer collectors in their 20s and early 30s that have sought out BGS or Beckett for basketball cards, for Bowman Chrome cards. People tend to have their preferences. They like to go one or the other. They like to have a whole case, a whole display of just one uniform color. People even have taken as far as to have the same PSA lighthouse flip holder style for all of their slabs in their display. So that just makes it more difficult to sort of penetrate into that market, to steal that market share, but to also get people to try to flip their whole collections to your holder when you're not one of the top three. And on top of all this, the higher risk that the card will be trimmed, altered, or fake. PSA has been through a lot, but they're also dealing with much higher volumes. And they also have a lot more respect in the industry for catching altered and trimmed cards. It's happened, and it's happened a lot. So GMA and BCCG, I'm sorry, but they just don't have that reputation right now. So the conclusion here is if you are to purchase an item that is GMA graded or BCCG graded, I would exercise a lot of caution. Personally, what I would do is I would only buy that type of card in person. I would hold up, I'd make sure you have decent lighting, have a loop if you can, and really inspect that card. If you're buying a BCCG 10, make sure that it's at least a PSA 8 or 9 and that you're paying those prices for it, hopefully a little less, because these cards don't turn over all that often. Dealers should be more willing to give you a discount for these types of cards. And when you decide to sell the GMA or BCCG graded card, just know that it might take a little bit longer than usual. There's just less demand for those slabs in the marketplace. I've seen it with just SGC versus the major two. People have their preferences, and GMA and BCCG are usually on the bottom of the list, maybe crossed out altogether. So, and you also have to question how much your conscience will be affected by you selling one of these cards to a collector or investor that just might be a little less experienced. In regards to actually submitting my own cards or crossing over cards to GMA, despite the cost, despite the really appealing turnaround that's guaranteed, I just can't see any use cases for myself to do that. And I guess we'll just leave it at that. So put down your comments below. What do you feel about GMA, about BCCG, maybe about some of the other independent card grading companies that you've heard of, maybe you have first-hand experience with, and hopefully we can start up a dialogue and take this a little bit further. All right, guys, hopefully you liked what you saw. Like, comment, subscribe. Philmington out.